Imagine a world where June 6th, 1944 never happened. A world where the D-Day landings were cancelled, not for a lack of soldiers or ships, but because London, or maybe New York, had simply ceased to exist. This nightmare was the biggest secret and the greatest fear of the Allied High Command during World War II. The fear that Nazi Germany, the birthplace of the world's greatest physicists, Einstein, Planck, Heisenberg, would create a weapon capable of winning the war in a single strike, an atomic bomb. The Allies knew they didn't just have to beat Hitler, they had to do it fast, before he could succeed. And to do that, they couldn't just fight on the front lines. They had to launch one of the daring and desperate intelligence operations in history. This isn't just a story about soldiers. It's a story of spies, commandos, and scientists in a race against time. So, how did the Allies steal the German atomic plans? Well, the truth, as usual, turned out to be far more complicated and insane than a simple Hollywood myth. It all began in Berlin in 1938. German chemists Otto Hahn and Strassmann made a breakthrough. They split the uranium nucleus. Physicists around the world immediately realized what this meant: a chain reaction, an unimaginable release of energy. The Nazi leadership created its own uranium club. At its head was the Nobel laureate, the genius of quantum mechanics, Werner Heisenberg. At the same time in the U.S., Einstein wrote his famous letter to President Roosevelt, warning that Germans might build a bomb. Thus, the Manhattan Project was born. But the Manhattan Project had a dark shadow, a ghost that haunted them. What if Heisenberg, still in Germany, was ahead of them? The problem was, the eyes were working blind. They knew nothing for sure. Intelligence was fragmented. They heard rumors of massive underground factories, of thousands of scientists working around the clock. Fear was their greatest enemy. General Leslie Groves was obsessed with one question: how close are they? The Allies' first step wasn't sabotage, it was sabotage. To build a reactor, a necessary step toward a bomb, the Germans needed a moderator to control the chain reaction. They had two choices: graphite or heavy water. For several reasons, perhaps a scientific error or not, Heisenberg bet on heavy water. And there was only one plant in the world that produced it on an industrial scale: the Vemork hydroelectric plant in occupied Norway. The mission was clear: destroy the plant, but it was nearly impossible. It stood on the edge of a 600-foot sheer cliff, surrounded by minefields, searchlights, and Nazi guards. The first attempt, Operation Freshman in 1942, was a disaster. 2 gliders carrying British commandos crashed. The survivors were captured and executed on Hitler's orders. But the British special executive did not give up. They prepared a second team, this time a small group of Norwegian commandos who knew the terrain perfectly. Operation Gunner Sight. On an icy February night in 1943, they did it. They infiltrated the plant, planted explosives in the heavy water production bay, and escaped, skiing hundreds of miles to neutral Sweden. The explosion was perfect. It didn't kill a single German, but it destroyed months of heavy water production and critical equipment. The Germans were furious. They sent 3,000 soldiers to find them, but found no one. They tried to restart production, but the Allies bombed the plant from the air. Finally, in desperation, the Germans decided to transport the remaining heavy water stocks to Germany by ferry. But the Norwegian resistance struck one last time, knowing civilians might be on board, but understanding the stakes. They planted a bomb on the ferry. The hydro ferry sank in the deepest part of the fjord,
taking Hitler's last hopes for heavy water to the bottom. This operation didn't steal the plans. It tore out the most important page. The sabotage in Norway bought the Allies time, but the main question remained. What exactly did the Germans know? What were their plans? To answer this, General Groves created a top-secret unit. It was unlike any other. A mix of soldiers, spies, and nuclear scientists. They called it the Alsos mission. Alsos is the Greek word for Groves, a subtle nod to General Groves. The Alsos missions objective was simple: follow the advancing Allied armies. While regular soldiers captured cities, Alsos captured laboratories, documents, and most importantly, scientists. They landed in Italy, but found nothing. Then, right after D-Day, they landed in France. In Paris, they burst into Frederic Joliot-Curie's lab, and again, almost nothing. But in November 1944, in Strasbourg, they got lucky. They seized a laboratory at the University of Strasbourg, and there, in a wastebasket, Gutzman found letters. They were letters from Heisenberg and other members of the Uranium Club. Gutzman, reading them by flashlight, couldn't believe his eyes. He expected to find bomb blueprints, reactor diagrams, but the letters painted a very different picture. The Germans were arguing about the basics. They were still trying to get an experimental reactor to work. They weren't even sure how a chain reaction and a bomb actually worked. Gutzman realized the shocking truth. They have nothing. They are years behind. But the Alsos mission wasn't finished. They knew the Germans were trying to build something. The question was, where? Intelligence led them to the small town of Heidelorf in southern Germany. The race was on. Alsos Edegowka before the town was captured by French troops who weren't in on the atomic secret, or even worse, the Russians. In April 1945, just weeks before the end of the war, Passerskin stormed Heidelberg, and they found an old beer hall, and beneath it, in a cave in the rock, they found it, the last German nuclear reactor, B8. It was a primitive contraption, hundreds of uranium cubes hanging from chains, meant to be submerged in a tank. But they didn't even have enough heavy water to fill it. The reactor never reached a critical state. It never worked. It was a failure, a brilliant, complex, but absolute scientific failure. Boris Paz ordered the reactor dismantled immediately. They hid the uranium cubes and blew up the cave to cover their tracks. Then they went for the grand prize. They found Heisenberg at his cabin in the mountains. When the soldiers burst in, the great physicist simply said, "I've been expecting you." So, did the Allies steal the German atomic plans? No, because there was nothing to steal. The program was a ghost, a shadow, inflated by Allied fear to unimaginable proportions. The truth was far more interesting. Instead of one stealing, there were three great operations. The first, Operation Gunnerside, was a daring act of sabotage that starved the German project of its fuel, heavy water. The second, the Alsos mission, with an intelligence race that couldn't find plans but proved they didn't exist and captured the Reich's entire scientific brain trust. And the third, Operation Epsilon, was a psychological game that, using microphones at Farm Ho, revealed the ultimate secret: why the German geniuses had failed. The story of the German atomic bomb isn't the story of what was stolen. It's a story of what, thankfully for the entire world, never came to be.